The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Tanya Reynolds packed her last items into her suitcase. After 15 years with the U.S. Marshal Service, she had learned to pack light and efficient. This vacation was long overdue. 3 years had passed since she last took time off, always putting her duty first. Tanya glanced at her watch, 5:30 a.m. Perfect timing. She'd always been early for everything in her life. Her father, a retired army sergeant, had drilled punctuality into her from childhood. Early is on time is late, he would say. That lesson stuck with her through school, college, and now her career as a U.S. Marshal. The taxi arrived right on schedule. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, helped load her luggage into the trunk. "Airport today?" he asked with a friendly smile. "Yes, please." "International terminal," Tanya replied, returning his smile. The roads were still quiet this early in the morning. Tanya watched the city slowly come to life as they drove, storekeepers raising their shutters, joggers on their morning runs, and street vendors setting up for the day. She felt a wave of excitement. This vacation to the Bahamas was her reward after closing a particularly difficult case that had kept her working 16-hour days for months. They arrived at the airport 3 hours before her flight. Some of her friends teased her about always being so early, but in Tanya's line of work, being prepared was everything. She thanked the driver, tipped him generously, and wheeled her luggage into the bright airport terminal. The check-in process went smoothly. When the airline staff noticed her booking, the young woman behind the counter smiled. "First class to Nassau. Very nice, ma'am. Treating yourself?" Tanya nodded. "I think I've earned it." "I'm sure you have," the woman replied, handing back her passport and boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight." Security was a breeze for Tanya. She knew the drill better than most, quickly removing her shoes, belt, and jacket before placing them in the tray. The TSA agent recognized her credentials and gave her a respectful nod as she passed through. With 2.5 hours still to kill, Tanya found a quiet coffee shop away from the busiest part of the terminal. She ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin, then settled into a corner table. From her bag, she pulled out a dog-eared paperback, a mystery novel she'd been trying to finish for months. Finally, she had time to read for pleasure rather than work. As she read, Tanya occasionally glanced up to people watch, a habit from her training. She noticed families saying emotional goodbyes, business people hurrying with their briefcases, and couples walking hand in hand toward their gates. Everyone had their own story, their own journey. Today, for once, she wasn't responsible for any of them. At precisely 45 minutes before departure, Tanya packed up her book and headed to her gate. The waiting area was filling up with passengers, many looking tired or anxious. She found a seat near the boarding door and checked her phone one last time. A text from her sister wished her a safe flight and reminded her to actually relax for once. The gate agent announced pre-boarding for passengers needing extra assistance, followed by first class. Tanya gathered her carry-on bag and headed toward the jet bridge. She noticed a few looks from other passengers as she got in the first-class line. She was used to it by now, people making quick judgments based on what they saw, a black woman in casual clothes. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, a well-dressed businessman behind her huffed impatiently. Tanya didn't turn around. Today was about leaving work stress behind, not creating new tension. She boarded the plane and found her window seat in the second row. The leather was soft and spacious, such a change from her usual economy seats on government-funded work trips. A flight attendant offered her a choice of water or champagne. Tanya chose water and settled in, looking forward to the peaceful hours ahead. Little did she know that peace would be short-lived and her professional skills would soon be tested in an unexpected way. Tanya had just settled into her comfortable first-class seat when she felt eyes on her. Looking up from arranging her things, she noticed a man staring at her from the aisle. He wore an expensive gray suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, with a gold watch glinting on his wrist and designer shoes polished to a perfect shine. The man checked his boarding pass, then looked back at her with narrowed eyes. Tanya recognized that look immediately. She'd seen it countless times before, in restaurants, in stores, and now here on this plane. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here." She chose to ignore him, reaching instead for her book. Years of experience had taught her when to engage and when to let things slide. Right now, all she wanted was to start her vacation in peace. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying an edge of annoyance. "I think you might be confused." Tanya looked up, raising an eyebrow but saying nothing. "This is first class," he continued, speaking slowly as if she might not understand. "The regular boarding hasn't started yet. You should probably head back to the main cabin." A few nearby passengers glanced over. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. An older woman across the aisle frowned at the man's words. Tanya took a deep breath. She dealt with far more dangerous people in her career than this prejudiced businessman. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied calmly, turning her attention back to her book. But the man wasn't satisfied. He shifted his expensive leather briefcase to his other hand and leaned slightly closer. "Look, I fly this route twice a month. First class is nearly $2,000. There must be some mistake with your boarding pass." What he was really saying couldn't have been clearer if he'd shouted it. "How could someone like you afford to be here?" A flight attendant named Miguel approached, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his professional smile firmly in place. "Actually, no," the man replied quickly. "I believe there's been a seating mix-up." Miguel turned to Tanya. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Without a word, Tanya handed over her pass. She maintained eye contact with the businessman the entire time, her face betraying no emotion despite the heat rising inside her. This was supposed to be the beginning of her vacation, not another battle against prejudice. Miguel checked the boarding pass and nodded. "Everything is correct, ma'am. You're in the right seat." He turned to the man. "Sir, if I could see your boarding pass, please." The man handed it over with an impatient huff. "Mr. Whitman, your seat is 4C, just a few rows back," Miguel explained, pointing toward the rear of the first-class cabin. Richard Whitman didn't move immediately. Instead, he muttered under his breath just loud enough for Tanya to hear, "Must be some kind of special program or upgrade. They're giving these seats away now." A young man sitting nearby looked up sharply at the comment. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. Tanya felt a familiar tightness in her jaw. She'd worked hard for everything she had. 15 years serving her country, putting her life on the line, making sacrifices most people couldn't imagine. And this man had decided, based solely on her appearance, that she couldn't possibly have earned her place here. Miguel stood firm, waiting for Richard to move on. "Sir, other passengers are boarding. If you could please take your assigned seat." With a final dismissive glance at Tanya, Richard finally moved toward his seat, his stiff posture radiating indignation. As Miguel turned to go, he gave Tanya an apologetic look. "I'm sorry about that, ma'am. Can I get you a drink before takeoff?" "Complimentary, of course." "Just water, thank you," Tanya replied quietly. As Miguel left to get her water, Tanya noticed the older woman across the aisle watching her with kind eyes. The woman gave her a small, understanding smile before returning to her magazine. Tanya tried to focus on her book again, but the words blurred on the page. The confrontation had stirred up feelings she usually kept carefully contained. She thought about revealing her badge right away, but something held her back. Why should she have to prove herself to someone like him? The plane continued to fill with passengers. Tanya took a deep breath and decided that Richard Whitman had taken up enough of her energy. But little did she know, their interaction was far from over. The plane was almost fully boarded now. Tanya sipped her water and tried to lose herself in her book, but she couldn't focus. The words on the page blurred as her mind kept replaying the encounter with Richard Whitman. She dealt with prejudice her entire career, but it still stung each time. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Richard still glaring at her from his seat a few rows back. He was on his phone, talking loudly enough that several passengers could hear him. "You won't believe what's happening on this flight," he was saying to whoever was on the other end. "They're letting just anyone into first class these days. The standards have really gone downhill." A businessman across from him shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A young woman 2 rows ahead turned to give Richard a disapproving look. Miguel, the flight attendant, approached Richard. "Sir, we're preparing for takeoff. You'll need to switch your phone to airplane mode or turn it off completely." Richard barely acknowledged him, holding up one finger as if to say just a minute while continuing his conversation. I know, right? I pay full price for this experience, and now I have to share it with people who clearly don't belong. Miguel's professional smile tightened. Sir, I must insist. FAA regulations require all devices to be. Fine, fine, Richard interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. He ended his call but didn't put his phone away. Instead, he began typing furiously, presumably sending messages or emails. Tanya took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She had hoped this vacation would be a break from stress, not the beginning of more. The plane hadn't even taken off yet. A gentle tap on her shoulder made her open her eyes. It was the older woman from across the aisle, holding out a small package of cookies. Would you like one, dear? She asked with a warm smile. I'd always bring these for flights. My grandkids say they make everything better. Tanya smiled back, grateful for the simple kindness. Thank you, that's very sweet of you. I'm Helen, the woman said, settling back into her seat. Been flying this route for 30 years, visiting my daughter in the Bahamas. Never gets old. I'm Tanya. First time to the Bahamas, actually. Long overdue vacation. Well, you picked a beautiful place, Helen said. Don't let anything, or anyone, spoil it for you. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion a few rows back. Richard was now arguing with Miguel about putting his laptop away for takeoff. Do you know how much business I conduct? I pay for first class specifically so I can work, he was saying, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. Sir, the same safety rules apply to all passengers, regardless of ticket class, Miguel explained patiently. We can't take off until all large electronic devices are stowed. Richard reluctantly put his laptop in the overhead compartment, muttering about ridiculous rules and declining service. As Miguel walked away, Richard called after him. And could I get a proper drink? Scotch, neat. Top shelf, not the cheap stuff. Miguel nodded, though his smile had completely vanished by now. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay due to air traffic. Richard groaned loudly and unbuckled his seatbelt, standing up. Sir, you need to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened, a different flight attendant called out. Richard ignored her, walking toward the front of the first-class cabin, directly toward Tanya's row. He stopped beside her seat, looking down at her. I just wanted to see what was so special, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Must be nice getting all these perks without having to work for them. The cabin grew eerily quiet. Everyone within earshot was now watching the confrontation. Tanya looked up at him, her expression calm despite the anger building inside her. You don't know the first thing about me or how hard I work, she said quietly. Oh, I think I do, Richard replied with a smirk. Let me guess, some diversity initiative? Corporate sponsorship? Or maybe you know someone who pulled some strings? Helen looked appalled. Young man, that is quite enough. Richard barely glanced at her. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. When I pay premium prices, I expect a premium experience with people of a certain caliber. Several passengers gasped. The lead flight attendant was now hurrying toward them, her face concerned. Tanya felt a familiar calm wash over her, the same calm that came during tense situations in her work. She'd faced down armed fugitives without flinching. This man was nothing more than a nuisance, but he was about to learn a valuable lesson. Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately, the lead flight attendant said firmly as she reached them. I will, Richard said, not moving. I'm just having a conversation with our unexpected guest here. The flight attendant looked at Tanya apologetically. Ma'am, I'm so sorry about this disturbance. Tanya nodded, making a decision. It was time to end this. She reached slowly into her jacket pocket, feeling the weight of her credentials wallet. Richard Whitman was about to discover exactly who he had been harassing, and Tanya couldn't help but feel a small twinge of anticipation at the look that would soon cross his face. Actually, she said, her voice clear and steady, there's something Mr. Whitman should know. The entire first-class cabin had gone silent. All eyes were fixed on Tanya and Richard, who stood looming over her seat with a smug expression. The lead flight attendant looked torn between calling for backup and giving Tanya space to handle the situation herself. There's something you should know, Tanya repeated, her voice steady as she pulled out her credentials wallet from her jacket pocket. Richard crossed his arms, the smirk still plastered on his face. What's that? Your food stamps card? Or maybe a note from whoever felt sorry enough to upgrade you? A few gasps came from nearby passengers. One man shook his head in disbelief at Richard's rudeness. With deliberate slowness, Tanya flipped open the leather wallet to reveal her badge and ID card. The gold eagle emblem caught the cabin light, shining bright against the dark leather. United States Marshal Service, she said clearly, holding it up so Richard could see it properly. I'm Deputy Marshal Tanya Reynolds, and to answer your earlier question, no, I didn't get any special handouts. I paid for my seat, just like you. Richard's face went through a remarkable transformation. The smug smile vanished instantly. His eyes widened, and the color drained from his face so quickly it was as if someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. A soft "oh snap" came from a teenager a few rows back, followed by his mother shushing him. I've been with the Marshal's service for 15 years, Tanya continued calmly. I track down fugitives, protect federal witnesses, and ensure the safety of our federal judges. Last month, I led a task force that apprehended one of the FBI's 10 most wanted. That's the work I do. Richard took a small step back, suddenly very interested in his shoes. So when you make assumptions about who belongs in first class or who works hard, you might want to consider that appearances can be deceiving. Helen, the older woman across the aisle, broke into a wide smile. Well, I'll be, she said softly. The lead flight attendant, her nemetic red Lisa, looked at Tanya with newfound respect. Marshal Reynolds, is there anything we can do for you? Just ensuring this gentleman returns to his seat would be helpful, Tanya replied. We all want a peaceful flight. Lisa turned to Richard. Sir, return to your seat immediately. Further disruptions may result in you being removed from this aircraft. Richard seemed to shrink inside his expensive suit. The man who had been so confident, so condescending just moments ago, now looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. I didn't realize, he stammered. That was clear, Tanya said evenly. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to start my vacation. A few passengers broke into spontaneous applause as Richard slunk back to his seat, his shoulders hunched and his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Lisa leaned closer to Tanya. Marshal, if he causes any more trouble, please let us know immediately. We don't tolerate harassment of any kind on our flights. Thank you, but I think he's learned his lesson, Tanya replied, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Men like Richard rarely change their views overnight. They just learn to be more careful about who they shared those views with. As the applause died down, Helen reached across the aisle to touch Tanya's arm gently. That was beautifully handled, dear. My late husband was in law enforcement too, state police for 30 years. He always said the best officers never needed to raise their voice to command respect. Tanya smiled. Your husband sounds like a wise man. He was, Helen said with a wistful smile. He also would have offered to buy you a drink after witnessing that display of dignity. So consider your first vacation cocktail on me. The airplane finally began to push back from the gate. Tanya felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. She glanced back toward Richard's seat. He was hunched over his phone, deliberately avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, peeked over the seat in front of Tanya. Excuse me, she whispered, her eyes wide with admiration. Are you really a police officer who catches bad guys? Her mother looked mortified and tried to pull her back. Caitlin, sit down. I'm so sorry, she said to Tanya. Tanya smiled at the girl. It's fine. And yes, something like that. We work with police officers a lot. That's so cool, Caitlin said, her eyes shining. I want to be like you when I grow up. As Caitlin's mother finally managed to get her to sit properly in her seat, Tanya felt a sudden warmth in her chest. Maybe some good had come from this unpleasant encounter after all. If that young girl saw possibilities for herself that she hadn't before, it was worth all the Richard Whitmans in the world. The captain announced they were next in line for takeoff. Tanya buckled her seatbelt and looked out the window at the airport moving past. Her vacation was finally beginning, though not quite in the peaceful way she had imagined. The plane climbed steadily through the clouds, leaving the city behind. Tanya watched through the window as the buildings shrank to tiny dots and then disappeared altogether. The sky turned a deeper blue as they ascended, and the gentle hum of the engines created a soothing background noise. She finally felt herself relaxing. The confrontation with Richard was over, but the memory still lingered. Throughout her career, she'd faced similar situations, people assuming she didn't belong, questioning her authority, or treating her with disrespect until they learned who she was. This was just one more story to add to the collection. Lisa, the lead flight attendant, returned with a glass of sparkling water. Marshal Reynolds, the captain, would like to extend his personal apology for the disturbance earlier. He's a former military police officer himself. Please tell him it's not necessary, Tanya replied. These things happen. Not on my flights, they don't, Lisa said firmly. Not without consequences, anyway. As Lisa moved away, Tanya noticed that the service in first class had begun. The flight attendants moved from seat to seat, taking drink orders and distributing warm towels. When they reached Richard's row, the interaction was noticeably cooler, professional, but without the warmth they showed to other passengers. Richard kept his eyes down, accepting his drink without making eye contact with the flight attendant. The confident, entitled man from earlier had vanished, replaced by someone trying desperately to become invisible. Word of the incident had spread throughout the cabin. Passengers occasionally glanced back at Tanya with looks of admiration or at Richard with disapproval. A quiet buzz of whispered conversations followed in their wake. Helen leaned across the aisle again. You know, I've been flying for decades and I've seen all sorts of behavior on planes. People forget their manners when they're stressed or tired. Tanya nodded. True enough. But what that man did, that wasn't stress or fatigue. That was something uglier. Helen's usually cheerful face turned serious. My husband and I marched in Selma back in '65. Thought we were building a better world. And we did, in many ways. But moments like this remind me how far we still have to go. Tanya was surprised. Helen didn't look old enough to have been in Selma, but then again, those marchers would be in their 70s and 80s now. We've come a long way, Tanya agreed. But yes, there's still work to do. Their conversation was interrupted when Caitlin, the young girl from earlier, appeared beside Tanya's seat, clutching a notebook and pen. Her mother stood anxiously behind her in the aisle. I'm so sorry to bother you again, the mother said. But Caitlin insisted. She's doing a school project on community helpers, and, well, she was wondering if you might sign her notebook. I told her you're probably trying to relax. Tanya smiled and took the notebook. It's no bother at all. She wrote a short note of encouragement and signed her name. Do you catch bad guys every day? Caitlin asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Not every day, Tanya replied. Some days are just paperwork. Not as exciting as the movies make it seem. Do you have a gun? Caitlin whispered. Caitlin, her mother scolded. That's not an appropriate question. Tanya laughed. It's okay. Yes, I do, but it's safely stored for the flight. The most important tools for my job are right here and here. She pointed to her head and then her heart, thinking carefully and caring about doing the right thing. Caitlin nodded solemnly, as if committing this wisdom to memory. Thank you so much, Caitlin's mother said as she guided her daughter back to their seats. She'll be talking about this for months. As they walked away, Tanya noticed Richard watching the interaction from his seat, a complicated expression on his face. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he quickly looked away. The meal service began soon after. Tanya enjoyed a surprisingly good airplane meal of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. The crew seemed to take special care with her service, though she hadn't asked for any special treatment. Midway through the meal, Lisa approached with a folded napkin. The gentleman in 4C asked me to give you this, she said quietly, placing it beside Tanya's tray. Tanya unfolded the napkin after Lisa had moved on. Written in neat handwriting were the words, I apologize for my inexcusable behavior. No excuses. I was wrong. Okay. She glanced back toward Richard's seat. He was focused intently on his meal, still avoiding eye contact. The note wasn't much. Certainly not enough to make up for his behavior, but it was something. Whether it was genuine remorse or simply embarrassment remained to be seen. Helen, who had watched the napkin exchange with interest, raised an eyebrow questioningly. An apology, Tanya explained. Of sorts. Helen said, not sounding entirely convinced. Better than nothing, I suppose. Tanya slipped the napkin into her book as a makeshift bookmark. The flight would be landing in Nassau in about 2 hours. Soon this would all be behind her, and she could focus on sun, sand, and much-needed relaxation. But as the plane continued its journey southward, she couldn't help wondering if anything had really changed in Richard Whitman's mind, or if he had simply learned to be more careful about showing his prejudice in public. The flight continued smoothly over the Atlantic. Tanya had managed to read several chapters of her book, occasionally pausing to chat with Helen. The older woman had fascinating stories about her life, from her days as a civil rights activist to her career as one of the first female professors at her university. In another situation, Tanya might have shown Helen her badge and swapped law enforcement stories, but today she was content to simply be a traveler, not Deputy Marshal Reynolds. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing they would be landing in Nassau in about 45 minutes. The announcement stirred activity throughout the cabin as passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing for arrival. Tanya noticed Richard had barely moved from his seat during the entire flight. He hadn't worked on his laptop or made business calls as he'd so importantly mentioned earlier. Instead, he'd kept to himself, only speaking when directly addressed by the flight crew. Now, as the plane began its initial descent, she saw him straighten his tie and smooth his hair, as if preparing to regain his composure before facing the world again. Liza approached Tanya's seat with a discreet smile. "We're preparing the cabin for landing, Marshal. I wanted to ask, will you be needing any assistance at the airport in Nassau? I can arrange for a staff member to help with your luggage or transportation." "Thank you, but that won't be necessary," Tanya replied. "I'm fully off duty for the next 10 days. Lisa lowered her voice. "The crew has been talking. We've all dealt with difficult passengers, but what happened today? Well, it struck a nerve with us. Thank you for handling it with such grace." Tanya smiled. "Just doing my best to keep the peace, on duty or off." "Well, speaking of peace," Lisa continued, "the captain has asked if you'd be willing to be the last to deplane, just so we can avoid any further incidents." Tanya understood immediately. They wanted to get Richard off the plane before her to prevent another confrontation. It was thoughtful, though part of her wanted to tell them it wasn't necessary. Richard Whitman wouldn't be causing any more problems today. "That's fine with me," she agreed. "I'm in no rush." As Lisa moved away, Caitlin appeared again, this time with a folded paper in her hand. Her mother followed close behind, looking apologetic. "I made this for you," Caitlin said shyly, handing Tanya the paper. Tanya unfolded it to find a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a woman with a badge and a cape, standing tall with her hands on her hips. Above the figure, in careful block letters, were the words Meilleur Sheikh Tanya, real hero. "It's wonderful," Tanya said, genuinely touched. "Thank you, Caitlin. This might be the best gift I've ever received on a flight." Caitlin beamed with pride. "I gave you a cape because you're like a superhero, but real." "That's very kind," Tanya replied. "But remember, you don't need a badge or a cape to stand up for what's right. Anyone can be a hero that way." Caitlin nodded solemnly. "That's what my mom says too." "Smart mom." Tanya winked at Caitlin's mother, who smiled gratefully. As Caitlin and her mother returned to their seats, Tanya carefully tucked the drawing into her book alongside Richard's napkin apology. Two very different mementos from an unexpectedly eventful flight. The plane began its final descent, dropping below the clouds to reveal the stunning turquoise waters of the Bahamas below. Passengers pressed against windows throughout the cabin, exclaiming at the beautiful view. Even Richard seemed momentarily captivated, leaning slightly to see out the nearest window. The island came into view, white beaches, palm trees, and colorful buildings dotting the coastline. Tanya felt the last of the tension from the earlier confrontation melting away. Soon she would be soaking up the sun, swimming in that incredible blue water, and putting the stress of her job behind her for a while. As the landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk, Helen reached across the aisle one last time. "I didn't want to say this earlier, but my son-in-law is the deputy chief of police in Nassau," she said. "If you'd like to join us for dinner one night, I know he'd love to meet you. Shop talk not required, of course. Tanya smiled. That sounds lovely. I'd like that. The plane touched down smoothly, eliciting a light round of applause from some passengers. As they taxied to the gate, Tanya noticed Richard gathering his things, movements stiff and deliberate. She wondered what he would tell his colleagues about this flight. Would it be a story about an entitled woman who happened to be a federal officer? Or might it be a moment of reflection, perhaps even a learning experience? The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began standing, retrieving bags from overhead compartments. Richard remained in his seat, shoulders tense. Tanya realized he was waiting, probably hoping she would exit first so he wouldn't have to walk past her. Helen noticed too. Some people never learn, she murmured, shaking her head. Maybe, maybe not, Tanya replied. But either way, I'm not going to let him ruin the start of my vacation. I've got sunshine and beaches waiting for me. The plane gradually emptied, passengers filing toward the exit, many nodding respectfully to Tanya as they passed. Richard finally stood, keeping his eyes forward as he made his way to the exit. Just before he stepped into the jet bridge, he hesitated, then turned slightly toward Tanya's row. For a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something different in his expression now, not quite remorse, perhaps, but something less hardened than before. He gave a small, awkward nod, then hurried away before Tanya could respond. The warm Bahamian air hit Tanya like a welcome embrace as she finally stepped off the plane. After waiting for most passengers to exit, she now walked alongside Helen toward the terminal. The jetway was bright with sunshine streaming through its windows, offering glimpses of palm trees swaying in the breeze outside. Nothing like that island air, Helen said, taking a deep breath. Makes you forget all your troubles instantly. Tanya smiled. I can already feel my stress melting away. They entered the terminal, a colorful space filled with tourists in vacation clothing, steel drum music playing softly in the background. Signs in bright colors welcomed visitors to the Bahamas. After the confined space of the airplane and the tension of the confrontation with Richard, the open terminal felt liberating. My daughter should be waiting at baggage claim, Helen said as they followed the crowd. You're welcome to share our taxi to the hotel district if you'd like. That's very kind, Tanya replied. Let me see if my hotel arranged transportation first. As they made their way through immigration and toward baggage claim, Tanya spotted Richard standing at a currency exchange counter. He seemed to be having some kind of problem with his transaction, gesturing impatiently at the clerk. Some habits died hard, it seemed. Baggage claim was bustling with activity. Tanya and Helen found spots near the carousel just as it started moving. Colorful suitcases of all shapes and sizes began rolling past. There's my daughter, Helen said suddenly, waving to a woman standing across the carousel. Come meet her when we get our bags. As they waited, Tanya felt someone approach from behind. She turned to find Richard standing there, looking uncomfortable but determined. He cleared his throat. Marshal Reynolds, he said stiffly. I wanted to speak with you before we parted ways. Tanya regarded him coolly. Yes. Richard shifted his weight from one expensive shoe to the other. My behavior on the plane was inexcusable. The note I sent doesn't begin to cover it. A nearby family glanced over curiously before looking away. Tanya said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I spent the last 3 hours thinking about why I acted that way, Richard said. It wasn't just a bad day or stress from work. It was, he struggled visibly with the words, it was prejudice, plain and simple. I made assumptions based on how you look, and that was wrong. Tanya studied his face, trying to gauge his sincerity. His eyes, which had earlier been full of entitlement and disdain, now showed something closer to genuine regret. I appreciate you saying that, she said finally. Recognition is the first step. But what matters is what you do going forward. Richard nodded slowly. I know. I have some serious thinking to do. He hesitated, then added, My 13-year-old daughter is joining me here tomorrow. She's always telling me I need to check my privilege. I thought she was just repeating things from social media, but maybe she understands something I don't. Children often do, Tanya replied. Maybe this is a chance to show her you're listening. A hint of a smile crossed Richard's face. Maybe so. He extended his hand. I won't ask for forgiveness, but I am truly sorry. After a moment's consideration, Tanya shook his hand. Enjoy your vacation, Mr. Whitman. You too, Marshal Reynolds, he replied, then glanced at her casual vacation clothes. Though I guess it's just Ms. Reynolds this week. Just Tanya will do, she said. It was a small gesture, but it felt right. As Richard walked away, Helen returned with her suitcase. Was that who I think it was? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Tanya replied, watching him disappear into the crowd. He came to apologize properly. And do you think he meant it? Tanya considered the question. I think he might have. Time will tell. Her suitcase appeared on the carousel, and she pulled it off with practiced ease. Together, she and Helen walked over to meet Helen's daughter, a smiling woman who immediately enveloped her mother in a warm hug. Mom, so good to see you, she exclaimed, then turned to Tanya with friendly curiosity. And who's this? Helen's eyes twinkled. This is my new friend Tanya. She's a U.S. Marshal on vacation, and she's got quite a story to tell. Tanya, this is my daughter, Linda. Nice to meet you, Tanya said, shaking Linda's hand. Your mother was a lifesaver on that flight. That's Mom for you, Linda laughed. Never met a stranger she couldn't befriend. Your first time in Nassau? First time anywhere in the Bahamas, actually, Tanya admitted. Well, you're in for a treat, Linda said enthusiastically. The water is like nowhere else on Earth. We're heading to dinner at a fantastic local spot tonight. You should join us. As they walked toward the exit, Tanya caught a glimpse of Caitlin and her mother. The little girl spotted her too and waved excitedly. Tanya waved back, smiling at the child's enthusiasm. Outside, the full beauty of the Bahamas greeted them. The sky was impossibly blue, palm trees lined the roadway, and the warm breeze carried the scent of salt water and tropical flowers. After 15 years of chasing fugitives and protecting witnesses, Tanya was finally taking time for herself. She looked back at the airport one last time, thinking about the unexpected start to her vacation. What began as an unpleasant encounter had led to new friendships and perhaps even a moment of growth for someone who needed it. As she slid into Linda's car beside Helen, Tanya felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of peace. For the next 10 days, she wasn't Marshal Reynolds with all the responsibility that entailed. She was just Tanya, a woman on vacation, ready to enjoy the beauty around her. So, Linda said as she pulled away from the curb, Mom mentioned something about dinner with my husband's police colleagues. They'll be thrilled to meet you. Tanya laughed. I thought shop talk wasn't required. Helen winked. I said it wasn't required. I never said it wouldn't happen. As they drove toward the hotel district, the three women chatting like old friends, Tanya realized that sometimes the most meaningful connections came from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, just maybe, a single interaction could change something for the better, whether in herself, in Richard Whitman, or in young Caitlin with her crayon drawing of a hero without a cape.